It's Brian Wilson alongside the birthday boy, Larry O'Connor.
Major Eric Navarro is a combat veteran from Iraq. He served 2 tours in Iraq. In fact, now a major in the United States Marine Corps Reserves. He's also the author of the book, God Willing, My Wild Ride with the New Iraqi Army. And we want to hear about that wild ride and how it might inform our understanding of what's going on in Iraq right now as that new Iraqi army is literally under siege. Thanks for joining us, Major.
Hey, thank you.
So when you look at what's going on over in Iraq right now and you see these terrorists formed under the name ISIS making their way toward Baghdad and taking over some of the towns that you fought in and secured on behalf of the Iraqi people, what's your overriding opinion on what's happening there and why it's happening?
Well, it's extremely frustrating to watch the events because they were entirely predictable. In fact, I talked about this in my book. I thought we should have stayed in the entire time and never left. I was there in 2004 and 2005, and then later in 2007, 2008. My first tour, I was an advisor of the Iraqi Army. That's where I wrote the book. And when we first started working with them, they could barely operate on a 10-man level. By the time, about 7 months later, we left, they were operating at a 100-man level, at a company level. So they showed some dedication. There were still some problems and some cultural issues to overcome. But if we stayed and stayed engaged the entire time, I think the results would be a lot different. Right? As soon as we would leave, they would resort to their old ways of unprofessionalism. They would only care about themselves. There would be sectarian strife, and that's what you're seeing right now, right? So I think the recent report is ISIS now controls about 70% of the Sunni areas. Well, that's because the army was mostly made up of Shiite after Saddam's fall, and they really didn't treat the Sunnis properly, right? But by the time my second tour in 2007, 2008, we had experienced what would be called the awakening, right? And we had somehow convinced the Sunni to buy into the new Iraqi government. I think as soon as we left, Maliki stepped in and the sectarian issues arose. And I just think that we should have stayed in. We should have had bases. We should have had a status of forces agreement in place, and we would have been able to meet this terrorist threat. Now, you're seeing that now the president has to announce 300 advisors going back in because that's what they should have stayed in the entire time.
Okay, so look, that's what you think we should have done, but we didn't do it. So I guess my question is, what do we do now?
Well, unless you want to see a regional war between Shia and Sunni, I say we go back in.
Really?
And I don't mean full-on combat operations. I don't mean boots on the ground in large numbers. I mean we should establish a advisor program that engages and advises the Iraqi military throughout all steps of fighting this fight. We should support them logistically, command and control-wise, and through airstrikes. If you want to get, I believe the president just signaled his willingness or his desire to see Maliki go. I think that might be a positive step because I think he has been part of the problem, and I think they just had a new election, so it's constitutionally mandated that to form a new government. So this is a perfect opportunity to wipe the slate clean and go back in and establish permanent bases. We should never have left.
Okay. So let's talk about that because, a lot of people are pointing to the October 2011 decision by Barack Obama and his team there, Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton, most prevalently there, as part of the negotiating team for that status of forces agreement. And they claim that they couldn't keep our troops there because they wouldn't have been given immunity from Iraqi courts. They were trying to get that from the Iraqi government. They wouldn't grant immunity to our American troops. What do you stand on that?
Well, I don't want to directly criticize the President of the United States. I will say it's an incredibly difficult situation. And we weren't in the negotiations with Maliki. But I will say that when you have troops on the ground, you can exert your influence. And that's what we had at the time. And I can't believe that we couldn't have exerted great influence over Maliki's government. I don't see why we couldn't get immunity for our troops. And I would ask also, we're sending now 300 advisors back in. and nobody seems to be able to answer whether or not that immunity for the troops is in place right now.
That's a good point, Major.
Right. So, if they're not immune, then why did we have the argument back in several years ago when negotiating the status of forces agreement? And I would say, regardless, we had to support the country, because if it breaks up, which is I believe what Biden had once said should happen, right, amongst Kurd, Sunni, and Shiite lines, that will destabilize the entire region. And you're seeing that right now, right? You're seeing refugees spill over the border. You're seeing that right now ISIS controls parts of Syria and Iraq. So the entire region would break apart, or at least be destabilized along Shiite and Sunni lines. That is not good for the entire world.
All right. So I'm very troubled by the fact that you say that as soon as we left, the Iraqi forces sort of lost their focus, lost their ability, lost their cohesion, because what we have heard is they're folding like a cheap suit. Are you surprised by that?
Not at all. That's exactly what would happen if we weren't there. Anytime we got into an engagement, we had to, me and my fellow team advisors had to be the backbone and stiffen their spine in the face of enemy fire. Right? Now, there were certain leaders amongst the battalion that I was with that were strong, but they're few and far between. Right? So, without strong American support to stay there and guide them as they develop over years, not just a couple years, but 5, 10, 20 years. Right? Because if you look at it, the main goal, right, is not the adults of the Iraqi people right now, right? They grew up in a screwed-up system under Saddam Hussein, right? An unprofessional system, rife with corruption and sectarian issues, right? What you're trying to do is establish an area for a environment for the kids, the children of Iraq, to grow up in a stable, democratic country where that's all they know, right? That will then foster a greater development in sense of professionalism, sense of nationalism, maybe be able to develop a peaceful coexistence with its neighbors or with its own citizens. That's why we have to stay, or we should have stayed, for generations. Okay, we haven't left Germany, Japan, Korea. Why? Because it promotes peace, right? It may be counterintuitive to certain people in this country, but it's called defense in depth, right? We don't stay in our country behind high walls. We go out. We try to develop other militaries in other countries that will then be allies for generations.
Well, listen, I think we do a lot of good sometimes when we stop and listen to the folks who've actually been there instead of listening to the politicians and their different ideas about this. Listen, I thank you so much for joining us today.
Okay, thank you.
It was Major Eric Navarro, his book, God Willing, My Wild Ride with the New Iraqi Army. He also writes over at taskandpurpose.com. Thanks, Eric.